Good morning. Good morning. Not a morning, it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is the last session of the virtual programming for NC Climate Week, and I'm so glad that you are here to join us. We're here because everyone has a role to play in taking action just to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. There are large goals in place to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. These are big goals. Closer to home, we feel the urgency after the big storms that we just experienced in Helene and just the devastation to Western North Carolina communities. And in fact, one of our speakers is from Asheville and won't be joining us today, but our other speakers are ready to jump in and cover his pieces. So we have had 8 virtual sessions this week to help close the gap between climate concern and knowing what to do about it, what climate action that you can take. Businesses, individuals, and governments all have a role, and we are thrilled that more than 30 professionals working in the field on some aspect of climate have joined us through this program to help accelerate the use of climate solutions. And we hope you'll take advantage of the recordings that we have from throughout the week. Those will be sent out to everyone if you missed any sessions and want to catch up on those. So just a word about Earthshare North Carolina. We are a coalition of 25 environmental nonprofit organizations, and our vision is to foster a collaborative community of nonprofits, business, and individuals who are dedicated to a sustainable future for generations to come. So we provide opportunities for individuals and businesses to get involved with the work of our nonprofit members. And in doing so, being able to contribute to the work for clean air and water, healthy places to live, safe food to eat, clean energy future, all of those things that are necessary for the protection of our natural resources, which is the bedrock on which we all depend. So with that, I'm just going to move on to 2 housekeeping items. One is that there's a Q&A function available to you on this Zoom call. And so if you have questions throughout or comments, please enter them there, and we'll be monitoring that. And then the last thing is that we will ask you to take a survey, brief, very brief survey at the end of the call to give us your feedback so that we can incorporate that as we continue to develop programming like this. And to thank you for that, we have a gift card to Great Outdoor Provision Company for 5 lucky people. We'll do a drawing at the end of the program, and so stay tuned and stick with us to do that. And with that, I would like to introduce Jeff Robbins, who is our moderator for this session. Jeff is the executive director for Clean Air NC, and he is just off of a 2-day conference for their own organization, the NC Breathe Conference. So Jeff came to Clean Air NC with a corporate background in sustainability and environment, social, and corporate governance support, known as ESG, and also bringing a passion for equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion into his role there. And so his interest in environmental justice and climate change was sparked by years of market research and project management. And Jeff, we're very happy to have you here with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather. It's an honor to be here, and I'm honored to be a moderator with such esteemed panelists, and we're looking forward to getting into it. First, a little bit about Clean Air NC. And Clean Air, AIRE, is an acronym for Actions and Innovations to Restore the Environment. We advocate for health of all North Carolinians by pursuing equitable and collaborative solutions that address climate change and air pollution. Our vision is where a stable climate and clean air create healthier lives for all. So today's panel and the discussion that we're having here is so appropriate because of obviously we fight for clean air, and the introduction and the prevalence and the movement towards renewables as well as EVs is paramount to our strategy and our message. So we are happy to participate, and I'm honored to be here to moderate. So our first panelist is Meg Finsel, who is with Sustain Charlotte, and Sustain Charlotte is one of our partner organizations here in the Charlotte area. We work with them on a number of things. Meg is the Director of Engagement and Impact at Sustain Charlotte, and one of the most knowledgeable folks that I've ever met around transportation and mobility. It's always an honor and pleasure to share the stage with Meg. So Meg, take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to get my slides started. And let's see. Sure, I can start the presentation here. Okay, great. So Sustain Charlotte is based here in Charlotte, as our name implies, and our mission is to inspire choices that lead to a healthy, equitable, and vibrant community for generations to come. And we really do that by focusing on the ways that we build our community, trying to build more upwards than sprawling outwards, and advocating for transportation choices so that people have options for how to get around. So we're going to talk a lot in this session about electric vehicles, and they're a really critical piece of solving the climate crisis. It's important to remember a car is a tool, and we need to have different tools in our toolbox, especially in areas of our state that are rapidly growing. We need to make sure that we have a variety of ways for folks to get around, even in areas that don't have growing populations. In many cases, over 30% of our residents don't drive a car. So it's really essential that we keep the mobility needs of everyone in mind as we're thinking about what equitable mobility really looks like. We use a very simple definition of sustainability, which is the ability to meet our needs today without compromising the ability to meet our needs in the future. And this is very timely as we're seeing the impacts of climate change right here in North Carolina in a very dramatic way. Transportation is the single largest sector contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And in many parts of North Carolina, where we don't have a lot of heavy industry or agriculture, it's an even higher percentage. So it does represent a major opportunity to address climate change by reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. This is a map of likely climate receiver places that was shared at the Congress for New Urbanism about a year and a half ago. And what you're seeing on the map of the size of those circles indicates population of cities and towns. And then the legend over on the right shows the climate risk score for those communities. So the darker purple in general was assessed to mean that that community is likely to be less impacted by climate change. And then as you move into the blues and the greens, they're still considered to be places that are likely to see people migrating due to climate, either voluntarily or involuntary. But large parts of the country, which are gray and white, are likely to be very impacted by climate change. So the reason I share this is as we think about the ways that climate change is affecting our community, our country, we're likely to see migration into especially the central and western parts of North Carolina, even as we see pretty dramatic impacts of climate change. Of course, along the eastern part of the state, we're likely to see more intensive hurricane impacts. But what's really fascinating about this map is that the areas that we saw most heavily affected this past weekend were considered to be very low risk for climate change. This really is shaking up a lot of the ways that we're evaluating how to make our communities resilient for climate change. As we plan our transportation networks, it's essential that we not only meet the needs of the residents that are currently living in our cities and towns and communities in North Carolina, but also that we meet the needs of the growing population, the changing population. In some areas that may mean population loss. What does it mean to meet the mobility needs in a community where your population may be declining due to climate change, migration, or other factors? So I wanted to kind of frame some of our conversation today within the context of climate change. So hopefully this map is useful for that. Also, it's really important that we consider the equity concerns of investing in transportation and mobility. This information is from the Center for Neighborhood Technologies Housing and Transportation Affordability Index. So in Charlotte, the median income household spends 22% of their income on transportation and 29% on housing. So you can look this up for different municipalities in North Carolina and across the country. But transportation is, for most households, the second highest expense. And when we think about the size of a person's world really being constrained by their ability to move around, for many individuals and households, that high cost of transportation can be a real barrier to their mobility. And for a person who does not own a car, their ability to access jobs and other daily destinations may be limited by the availability of public transportation. So for example, this is a map showing the number of entry-level jobs that a person could reach from their home within a 30-minute public transit commute. So even within the city limits of Charlotte, there are vast areas of the city that are really not accessible without a car. So as we think about the climate change and air quality benefits of electric vehicles, it's really important that we think about how to make sure more people can access those, and for those people who are unable to drive a car for various reasons, that we not forget about their mobility needs as well. The city of Charlotte has set a community-wide goal for the city as a whole to become a low carbon city by 2050 by reducing greenhouse gas emissions to below 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per person annually. They're doing quite well on their 2030 goal to transition to zero carbon vehicles and net zero carbon for buildings. This 2050 goal is a community-wide goal. It's really going to require changes in the ways that people live and travel. Along with Charlotte's planning process, they created a strategic mobility plan, and this is a plan to move people sustainably within the coming decades. So it includes, of course, the roadway network as we transition to more electric vehicles. We also need to reduce the percentage of trips that are taken by driving alone. So we need to invest in bicycle networks, safe, walkable streets and intersections. The greenway system often is only considered for recreation, but can be an important part of an active transit network. And then, of course, public transportation. So the strategic mobility plan included a projection based on rapidly growing population and the current percent of trips taken by driving alone, which in Charlotte is 76%. If we continue those current trends, we would have to double our road capacity by 2040. So this type of modeling is being done in many other cities. So I would encourage you to take a look at your city or municipality to see if these types of projections are being done. That's obviously not sustainable economically, socially, or environmentally. Nobody wants to have to double road capacities really across the political spectrum. We don't want to have to do that. So we need to think about how to more effectively use the existing street space. So over on the right-hand side, buses can carry a lot more people than general travel lanes that may only have 1 or 2 people per car. And then if we also make our streets safer for walking and biking, that's another option for people to get around, especially by some of those shorter distances. We also really advocate for smart growth. This is about building our communities in a way where we can get to most of our daily destinations without needing to drive. So this means creating and retrofitting streets and communities so that we have space for everyone and for different modes of transportation, as well as the movement of goods and services throughout that community. Sprawl is definitely a challenge to mobility. A lot of our cities, including Charlotte, grew during the kind of golden age of the automobile in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, where most of the development was pretty sprawling and spread out. And when the store is far from the school, is far from work, we often spend a lot more time and gas commuting and traveling to meet those needs. Whereas if those needs can be more clustered in the way that cities and towns used to be built before car ownership became common, we can often get where we need to go by walking, biking, and riding public transit. And of course, that has a reduced impact on the climate change because we're not contributing as much greenhouse gas emissions. 10-minute neighborhoods is a goal that Charlotte adopted when they adopted their transportation and land use plan in 2021. And this is a goal for all of our neighborhoods to have access to essential amenities, goods, and services within a comfortable tree-shaded 10-minute walk, bike ride, or transit ride by 2040. As we encourage people to purchase EVs instead of gas-powered vehicles, we also don't want that EV to have to be taken out for every single trip. So if we can leave our cars at home more often, we can have a more sustainable and lower carbon lifestyle overall. But that takes not only transportation planning, but also land use planning and investment. And finally, it's really important that as we plan to transition away from fossil fuels, that we are integrating public transit planning into that process. So as part of the City of Charlotte's Strategic Energy Action Plan, our transit agency, CATS, is also working on a plan to transition their vehicles away from fossil fuels. And as we think more regionally, the Connect Beyond planning process is really taking a look at how to connect Mecklenburg County as well as the surrounding counties by public transit. So as that process moves forward, we really need to consider both the needs of people who are driving, but also those people who will not be able to drive. So I just hopefully that was able to kind of frame some of our conversation around EVs as a really essential tool for fighting climate change, even as we consider them as part of the broader transportation network of walking, biking, public transit, carpooling. So I'll turn it back over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. I always learn something new every time we are together, and I thank you. And I have some questions, obviously. Our next panelist up is Jed Roth. He's with Kempower. He is the Vice President of Market and Products, and Kempower designs and manufactures DC fast charging solutions for electric vehicles. They're a team of electric vehicle enthusiasts with deep understanding of the charging market and the hands-on mentality. So welcome, Jed, and take it away.
Fantastic. I guess we had a little challenge today, so Heather's going to share my slides. And I was going to take over a little bit from. You can go to the next one. They can already see me. So good deal. Next slide, please. So we've got a panelist that couldn't come today, Stan Cross, and I wanted to kind of go through what he was going to talk about, which is just the environmental benefits of EVs. But before I do that, I think what I would encourage everybody to do is I'm going to do my best here, but if you would just go to LinkedIn, add Stan Cross and look at his latest page on just kind of what he's been through with the hurricane in Western North Carolina. That'll do a better job than I can do with this, because it just really gets down to what really is going on with our current state, the impacts of climate change, and it's on a very personal level. So I would encourage you, add Stan Cross, look at that post. But let's kind of go through what EVs do in both the short, medium term and the long term, and then we'll talk about kind of where we are right now in adoption and kind of what's to come and what you can expect as folks who are beginning to implement EVs throughout the ecosystem. So some of this I'm preaching to the choir, you already know, but I just thought we'd go through in the short term what you do. And the picture you see is an implementation we just did in Manhattan for a rideshare company. And they have the largest concentration of rideshare in the world there. And you can imagine what that does to a city when you think about taxi and the rideshare there and just the congestion. And so number one is zero tailpipe emissions. You get, even though there certainly are emissions at the utility level, you get those away from that concentrated area of the city and can see almost immediate impact when done in scale. The second thing is part of that, but the fun fact I always like to give, and there's some really easy math that I think that you can help people understand quickly, but it's lower CO2 emissions. And the way you can kind of figure that is a gallon of gasoline or diesel weighs about 8 pounds. Because you're putting a couple of oxygen molecules in with that burned carbon, the weight in CO2 that you get out of the 8 pounds of carbon burned is about 20 pounds. So the average MPG in the United States is about 25, right? So you can do some simple math and say for every mile I'm driving, I'm putting about 1 pound of CO2 into the atmosphere. A little less if you're at average, but it's easy math to say a pound. Just for comparison's sake, you as a human being put about 2 pounds a day into the atmosphere just through your respiration. So I have a long commute, but if I had an average 30-mile commute 2 ways, that's 60 pounds I put in a day. And you can just pretty soon see the tons and tons and tons of CO2. And I tell people, I don't really care where you stand on climate change. We can have that argument, but that's just science there. I mean, and you can imagine when you take thousands and thousands and thousands of vehicles in a congested area, how many hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 goes there. Obviously, an EV takes that totally away. Besides that, the next two go together: reduction in other air pollutants and health benefits. Obviously, you can track asthma rates, respiratory rates to pollution. You can match them up to areas of high pollution. It goes 1-to-1. I tell people I think to me that I like to tell stories, and the story I tell about that one is that I'm of the age where when I was a child, gasoline was leaded, and they can now track reduction in IQ to exposure to lead in the environment. I often tell my kids that's my problem, but it has a definite relationship. And then finally, Kempower is a Finnish company. So I travel to the Nordics. I travel there next week. They have a really high adoption rate of EVs. It's noticeable in the streets. So you have a quieter environment. Noise pollution matters. I used to have before I came to Kempower, I worked in the school bus industry. EV school buses have this multiplicative effect on kids because you don't have a loud engine, so the kids don't have to talk as loud. So that overall noise in the vehicle itself goes down, and everybody, driver, children, everybody's happier. Has that same kind of impact throughout the environment. Next slide, please, Heather. So along with short and medium term benefits come longer term benefits. Obviously, EVs allow synergy with clean energy, specifically, solar, microgrid kind of environments. When you have that, you can now take that clean energy and go directly to an EV, and that helps in a lot of ways. And one of the next ways is smart grid integration. So you can then integrate those microgrids into the larger grid and benefit from the vehicle itself. And then certainly now with vehicle to grid kind of applications, you can also use the vehicle as part of the grid. So can't do that with our current technology. Obviously, less fossil fuel dependency. That was originally in the first wave of EVs. That was kind of the pitch, was that we were less dependent on fossil fuels from other places and made energy security better. Then a second life of EV batteries. So I don't know if everybody knows this, there's a big market now for old Nissan Leaf batteries as backup power. That's going to happen for larger commercial vehicles. A lot of the early school bus implementations depended on that. So the battery actually came as a lease when the batteries useful life was over in the vehicle, plenty of useful life for other applications. And then finally, when you drive an EV, you're really driving a computer. I drive one every day, a lot of cool features for that. But the thing is, it takes us much easier to automated vehicles. I know a lot of people are terrified of that. As a person who has an 84-year-old mother on one side and a 17-year-old son on the other, I'm pretty much looking forward to the safety features of autonomous vehicles. And then let's go to the topic that I was going to address originally, which will go to the next slide, Heather, and that's kind of where we've been with EVs and where we're going. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call have been through this from like phase 1 to where we are right now. And maybe that seems like a long time, but I think the overall message is that we're just at the beginning and there's a lot of room to go and a lot of room for things to get better. So just to kind of take you through where we were and just how far we've come. You know, at the very beginning, everybody had an idea and everybody had their own charging system, and we had to get things standardized. So the very first thing was standardize the plugs, you know, get to CHAdeMO and NACS and CCS and get a few standards so people can charge up and down the spectrum. And then it was, okay, we've got these vehicles with less than 100 miles of range. That's not super practical. We need to go further. And then it was, okay, we've got, even though these vehicles don't have much battery, still taking forever to charge them. How do we charge faster? And I think in where we sit right now, we've got those three things figured. We've got a standard. We now have reasonable ranges. In some places, we have really good ranges. I think we're getting to the place where you can almost take range anxiety out of the equation. And then certainly charge faster. I look out in our parking lot and we've got charge rates anywhere from 100 kilowatts to 3. So we're now at the place where the vehicle can charge in a reasonable amount of time. So I think those are there. I think what's coming next is what takes us maybe over the threshold to mass adoption. So make it cheaper. And that's across the spectrum. From the infrastructure side, we kind of know that's the next frontier, that we've got to get infrastructure in ways that it can be installed at a rate that makes total cost of ownership reasonable. But I think maybe the bigger problem has been for mass adoption has been that let's make sure that we've got vehicles that are cheaper. And I think the battery is the cost, and that's the battery capacity in North America is increasing quickly, and that will come both for personal and commercial vehicles. And then after that, it's, you know, what's next? Make it autonomous, and what else can we do? So thanks so much for the time.
Jed, for all the information. That was great. And you also gave Stan a shout out, and I should mention Stan Cross with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is the electric transportation director. And we were together last week looking at charging stations and clean transportation and clean energy. So I appreciate the context of what Kempower is doing, and we look forward to some questions. And I'll have the audience make sure you start entering those questions in now as we welcome Brian Schneiderman with Self-Help Credit Union. Brian is the director of Avila programs at Self-Help Credit Union. They've got a ton of programs on financing and how to buy an EV now. And yeah, I'll turn the floor over to Brian because I know he's got a lot of great information, and they've got some really cool programs as well. So welcome, Brian. Take it away.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And like you were saying, Jeff, I feel like each of these conversations I learn more. So I'm sitting with my organization is Self-Help Credit Union, if you're familiar with us. But Self-Help is also part of a larger coalition called Climate United. And so some of our going deeper on electric vehicle financing is through our work with Climate United. And let's see, make sure. Oh, there we go. Hopefully, I always have trouble actually seeing the same thing you're seeing, but there we go. Hopefully it's a big screen now. Okay, so Climate United is actually a coalition of 3 organizations: Self-Help, Community Preservation Corporation, and Calvert Impact. And the reason we've come together is to be part of a program within the Inflation Reduction Act called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a part of the IRA that is really dedicated to bringing clean energy solutions to Justice 40 communities. So that's low wealth communities and communities that are economically more challenged. And so of the partnership, we really formed, these are all national organizations. And so Calvert Impact, some of you may be familiar with them. They do investment work in socially responsible investing, but they also do lending to community development financial institutions and large scale projects. CPC, Community Preservation, does financing for affordable housing, and then Self-Help does both of those things, but our focus in this coalition is around consumer lending. And so we've come together really, again, around the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There are 3 programs within the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program. The one that Self-Help and Climate United are focused on is called the National Clean Investment Fund. And Self-Help and Climate United are fortunate to have been one of the winners, one of the 3 winners of that fund, where we will be using $7 billion to try and help really transform the financing system so that there will be more access from credit unions and community lenders to be making loans across the country to low wealth communities. And so in that, we've gone big and deeper in a lot of this work. And it's really at the early stages, even though IRA was about 18 months ago or 2 years ago, this particular program is just getting going. So in terms of talking to you today, we heard some really great information from Meg and Jeff, and really appreciating that. So a number of you really are joining today. Either you have EVs or really curious about getting EVs. And so I appreciate Heather and her team is really, how do you think about action orientation? And so I think Jeff was also just sharing, right? We're at this point where we're starting to see adoption. And so these are some of the numbers from U.S. Energy Information Administration that we're starting to see more and more adoption of electric vehicles and other hybrids and PHEV vehicles. Because of the IRA, we're also seeing that there are now that many more manufacturers putting that many more different types of EVs. Range is increasing dramatically and infrastructure is growing. And so there's a growing opportunity. And so I'm not sure where folks on this call are, but when do you buy? And so I think the folks before in this conversation are making the case of why. And so hopefully folks are really trying to think about, well, when next? So one of the things, of course, is how do you think about the cost? And again, for Self-Help, we're really focused on low wealth communities and households. And so that's where we're currently concentrating. But I think this slide still is really telling in terms of thinking about some of the all-in costs. And so as more manufacturers come online with EVs, we're seeing those prices being driven down. There's also the tax rebate or the rebates of $7,500 And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you can add or that 7,500, that drives the price down fairly dramatically. And then, of course, again, this slide is when we start actually making loans for low wealth folks. Our subsidy will be passed on to low wealth households. And so you see, we'll be able to offer those folks lower interest rate. But even if your interest rate is comparable to the marketplace, your overall total annual savings will still be lower. And then one consideration is this range. But how do you think about range and your fuel cost? And so here's some average estimates that on an annual basis, you're also really saving dollars that go into your pocket. Annual maintenance cost on some national statistics, it is just lower on the maintenance to own an electric vehicle. And so again, even without with or without subsidized interest rate, your total annual savings of that life or the life of the financing of a vehicle can be lower with EVs. Now, if you go to higher end models, of course, you may be paying some additional luxury. So again, this is just one example to really demonstrate. And so what are some of the decision drivers? So again, one is the total ownership cost. And one thing I didn't have in the other slide that is worth noting, and others on the call may know a little bit more about it, but there is one thing to consider, that because we're still growing the infrastructure around maintenance, if you get into an accident with an electric vehicle, because there are fewer mechanics working on it, and because of the technology that's really tied into the whole system of the car, sometimes repairs after accidents can be greater than some of the ICE cars, the internal combustion engines. So again, just one thing to note of. The $7,500 rebates, there's a number of things to just keep into consideration, including income eligibility, and then also where is the car manufactured. In the slide that you saw before, it actually had an example of a Hyundai. Probably a better example might be some of the Chevy products that automatically get that $7,500. However, that's $7,500. There is a leasehold loophole where if you are buying a Hyundai or some other manufacturers that are currently not manufactured in the US, the dealer can actually pass on that $7,500 if you buy it through a leasehold. And so again, there are multiple ways to really approach that $7,500 rebate, but it goes a long way. Also earlier, my colleague was talking about, range anxiety. And so I really appreciate that range anxiety and the things that are coming are really going down. It is real. So I own one, and first time we drove to Greensboro, I had to do some extra thinking. So just being aware of that, it is manageable, but it does take a mindset. So keep in mind highway versus town. You use more power on the highway because you're not braking as much. Seasonality, when it's colder, it reduces the range of the battery. So again, you just got to plan for it. And then how much gear do you have on it? One of my colleagues was talking about, he put his bike rack on and he had he was driving down from San Francisco to LA, and he's got the rooftop luggage stuff, and that greatly reduced his battery power. You got to think about, charging speed. But again, it's manageable. There are apps that are really helpful. The one that's on there called ABRP is actually worked really well for us, and it's surprisingly accurate to drive a couple 100 miles, and it will actually tell you when and where you can stop. But again, it's a mindset. And so I think it's worth going down that road, but you got to know what you're in for. In terms of, well, which vehicle is right for me, there are a couple links there, EV Life, and then another spreadsheet for those real tech geeks. You can find all the information that has a matrix around comparing cars. And once you do buy your car, go to Facebook, tons of owners are sharing their tricks and tips. And so even while the market is still getting there, there's a lot of knowledge there. It makes it a heck of a lot easier. And actually, to be quite honest, it's just a fun ride. And so if you can make that mind shift, you can get there from a financial basis, and you can get there in terms of figuring out how do you convert to EVs. So that's just an overview of, again, how do you make the financing work? But I'll pass it back to Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Great information. We had a conversation last week in Detroit about charging etiquette. I don't know if there's any questions about that, but that's something that I know was a big point of discussion around our table as more and more people are buying EVs, and charging stations are going to be more in high demand. So things to consider. We do have some questions from the audience, so we're going to go through those. And the first one comes to us from Shirley Walker. And her question is, what is a reasonable amount of time for recharging EVs? So who would like to weigh in on that?
I can. I mean, and the answer is it depends on the on the EV. So it gets better and better. But I mean, the Hyundais, outside here can recharge in 20, 30 minutes from pretty close to 0 to up to 80%. But everything has to work, right? So you have to have a fast charger, and you have to have the car. So the weakest link in the system determines the speed. And that's the easiest way to answer it. So, I mean, reasonable to me is you take a break and in a trip and you use that break to take the time to recharge. I think cars are there now. But the other thing I always give to people is, so I've got an EV, it's got 55,000 miles on it. We have fast chargers here at work. I use those, but I don't have to. And I've used a fast charger about 12 times in 55,000 miles. So most of the time it's done at home. I wake up full and I never have to use it. And I think if that's your use case, you're perfect for an EV.
The
Thanks,
other
Jeff.
thing I would just add is, they are amazing for in town in particular, particularly if you have it at home. And the other thing to think about, like if you do take a long trip and you're concerned about a long trip, rent a car. So we can also get out of the mindset that one size has to serve all purposes. Again, you can map it out, but the other way to think about it, if I'm taking a long trip, or I've got to get an SUV to get my kids up to grandparents in Maryland, I'll rent a car if I need to. And that also, again, is another way to think about how to manage it.
Use the money you saved on gas for the year to rent the car. You'll still come out ahead.
There you go. Yeah, that's a great point. All right. Next question I know goes to something I've had conversations, Meg, with Shannon, and it comes from Kelly Bodie. One of the challenges I see with walking, biking is heat and, well, sweat. It feels like a major personal cultural shift needs to take place. Are there conversations happening around personal hygiene or examples from around the world that might help? So I know Shannon rides his bike into work. I've seen him. So we've had this conversation. I know you have a perspective.
Yes. So the first part of this is making sure that we have an environment that makes it as comfortable as possible to ride bikes in different climates and temperatures. So making sure that we have a strong street tree canopy is really essential. But that's still not going to stop you from sweating on a hot day. So a lot of this really requires just a kind of a culture reframing shift. I really think that leadership of organizations can play a valuable role here if we have a few folks in leadership or management positions that are bike commuters themselves, or even just do it occasionally, who are, you know, willing to let their colleagues see them a little bit sweaty. That can help to set the tone, versus if everybody's all, you know, arriving at the office very, you know, starched and buttoned up. And sometimes it, you know, it just takes some behavior change. So, you know, maybe grab a quick shower in the morning and a quick one at night instead of that longer one in the morning. Start your day off clean and use whatever, you know, deodorant or products that you need. Companies can also certainly help with this by making sure that employees at a minimum have a comfortable place to change, and maybe to keep a change of clothes, especially now that there's more of a kind of hot desking concept where employees may not have an assigned place, but making sure that they have somewhere to keep some toiletries and a change of clothes. Certainly having showers or locker rooms is great. Not a lot of companies necessarily have that built into their office space, but that definitely is kind of a gold standard. But I really think the most important thing is to have that culture shift, and it may require a conversation, or it could just happen kind of organically through setting examples from leadership and management.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Meg.
And even just kind of celebrating, hey, somebody showed up at a meeting and asked, you know, who walked or rode the bike or took public transit. Awesome, you guys are sweaty.
That's right.
Celebrate that.
Celebrate positive reinforcement. I love that.
Yes.
Thanks, Meg. All right, next question comes to us from Catherine Jones. What is being done culturally to shift the conversation around purchasing/owning an EV to one of necessity instead of one of luxury? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Not my area of expertise, but my 2 cents is, I think some of it is just awareness, right? So I think the Inflation Reduction Act has shared the awareness in a broader scale, but it's got a ways to do. And so I think as you have different rebate programs, all of a sudden people are more aware of it, or don't think about it as an other, right? It is accessible. And so I think that culturally, as we see more folks using it, that's very helpful. The other is, I think it then, by having more adoption and building the infrastructure that we've been talking about, it also makes it more plausible that states or municipalities can institute laws or policies that will require more adoption over time. And so I think it becomes a multi-step process. And so one is creating the accessibility, the financing opportunity, the infrastructure, and then from that, you know, again, culturally or policy-wise, it makes it easier to push a little harder on the necessity. That's my general sense as I've been following it.
I mean, I think the other thing is that EVs are great to drive. I mean, we've got, you know, for some reason we let the conversation always go to range anxiety and these other things and high cost, and that's starting not to be the case. I mean, so my 84-year-old mother picks up her EV tomorrow, and it's a used one, and there's also tax rebates for that. So I think that's another thing. So there is starting to be a used market that's also subsidized. But for me, I'm not sure I love the 0 to 60 in 5 seconds for her, but the safety features, you know, that are integrated because you're kind of driving a computer, and the visibility and other things that the EV has makes me super comfortable for her in that vehicle. So I think that they're great cars is kind of the other part of that. And that's really across the spectrum. So I think we don't spend enough time on that.
Yeah. Great point, Jed. Thanks, Brian. Quick question from Michael Rodrigo. How do insurance rates compare between internal combustion engines and EV vehicles? Any idea? I know, Jed, you own an EV and obviously transitioned from an ICE.
I've heard horror stories, but mine didn't change. I've got a Mustang Mach-E, and the rates really didn't change very much. But I've heard other places. I mean, I think that's another one of those it depends things about where you are. But yeah, my rates were the same.
Yeah. EVs are great cost-wise, long-term, but that often doesn't apply for low-income families that have to make more short-term choices. Whole plans seem like a good idea. How can EVs be made more accessible outside of loans? Loans can be great, but often become predatory for low-income families. How are these plans being made less predatory? So, Brian, that seems like it's up your alley.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's really important, right? So, from an equity perspective, if in 5 years or 10 years, the only people that own internal combustion engines are low wealth households, then shame on us, right? And so that's where programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, I think, are really important and valuable. And so the program that I was talking about during my presentation is that we have, many $billion to be able to subsidize products for low wealth households. And so the example for us, we're building out a product where we will have a significantly below market interest rate for low wealth households. And the goal is not just the long run, but in the short run, how do you actually make the monthly cost less for buying an electric vehicle than an internal combustion engine? So that's from the lending side, that is the key. In terms of how to make sure it's not predatory, is the funds that we will be getting, we're not the only ones who are going to be making loans. We actually are working with credit unions and lenders across the country where they will make the loans and then we will buy the loans from them. In that way, we will push the subsidy through other lenders. And so it's not a one-stop kind of lender. And so the hope is that we are also transforming the finance structure, the financing system, so that all people have access to credit, so they can buy non-predatory, or they can use non-predatory loans to be able to access and therefore receive all the benefits that we're talking about today. So I do think it's possible, but it's not easy.
Okay. Great. I believe we have probably time for maybe one more question. And Jed, this might be up your alley. Can anyone speak to the proposed NC charging infrastructure development? Will they be fast or slow charging stations? I know NEVI made provisions for, I think, level 2 or level 3. So maybe you can shed some light on that.
NEVI, is fast. It has to be 150 kilowatts. That's the answer. It has to be. There's specs around it, and there's specs around how fast, and there's specs around how reliable, which hits the two problems that have been historic. So, but I think the other thing to say is that that's an important program, certainly part of the BIL, but there's a lot of other efforts out there that aren't tied to that. So we see it all the time here. The network's getting built out.
Yeah. Great. All righty. Last one, I think. What are the concerns around natural resources required to make batteries for EVs, and how long can you expect a battery to last after purchasing a new EV?
Everybody that does one has an 8-year warranty at least. So, I mean, I don't know of anybody that doesn't do that. And I think I would almost rely on anecdotally. I have never met an EV person with significant in this way. Maybe if you go way back to some early Leafs and those kind of things that didn't quite have their cooling down, but in this last wave of EVs, it's pretty rare to see somebody with a problem around battery degradation. As far as, you know, the resources used, that is, I think, maybe the one environmental concern I have for EVs. I think, but a couple of things. Number one, think about where we are in the process. Everybody's aware of it. Constant work is getting done. And then the deal about, I would just challenge everybody on the recyclability thing. I mean, I've seen the Facebook posts too, but they don't really make sense because we don't have enough EVs out there in the United States, at least, for there to be this huge recycle effort yet. They're imminently recyclable. It's just it's not time to start recycling them yet. So I just would kind of appeal to everybody's sense of logic on that last point.
Yeah, and I'll add to the environmental side of things. We are working. There is a lithium mine located in Charlotte. We've had meetings and discussions about their methods, and so we're very mindful and watchful of what their method of extracting lithium safely and environmentally responsible way. So more to come on that front. I want to get to the last question quickly from Jerry Williams. Thank you for your question. Can you shed light on challenges for businesses to install DC fast charging infrastructure? Given power requirements, do demand-related charges make it cost prohibitive?
Yeah, so the demand charges are manageable. So I think, you know, that is around have a great piece of software to make sure that you're not spiking at the wrong time of day. So that's absolutely for sure. I think the other question though, to me, is the one where you just have to work with your utility. And it depends on what it is. I mean, in some cases it's no issue at all, that there's enough juice there to work with whatever you need. In some cases, you're going to have some help. I think it's manage your expectations, maybe like manage your fleet, start small, grow big, but get the utility involved at the very start.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. I know that there's probably a ton more questions out there. But Heather?
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff and Brian and Jed and Meg. Just amazingly straightforward information, just exactly what I think I needed to hear. There's people raising their hands. We are running out of time. I think if you want to jot down the names of the people on the call, I bet people would entertain these questions offline. And then I do want to direct your attention to the survey link that was put in the chat. And we ask you to take this survey, give us your feedback on the session. Again, it helps us tremendously in planning future programming. And we do have a thank you drawing at the end of the program for $25 gift cards to Great Outdoor Provision Company. So I will invite you to take that survey before you move on with your day. Invite you to take the information learned today and in prior sessions this week to heart. I think we similar to the point of a culture shift. There's intentionality, culture shift, things that we have solutions here available to us, and it just takes a little bit of a shift to move over to those. And so I encourage you, as I will do, to look at all these things closely from the week. And we will have all the presentations from the week available. We'll be sending those out to anyone who signed up for any of these calls. And so if you missed something this week and you want to go back and view it, that'll be available. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.